Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name's Matt Tipping. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and the Good Stream. The Good Stream is an idea that I had while doing lots of walking during the first lockdown. Could I create a prototype business in which I could push the boundary of my understanding of what it meant to do good with business? Doing good with business for me was really taking and building on the B Corp ideals that were instilled in my experience and the team's experience within my previous business, a business called Double Retail, which worked within the retail design and build industry. Well, the industry was and is still fantastically wasteful. Unfortunately, this is an undeniable fact, one which Double grappled with constantly through the demands of the design brief, sometimes the budget, and a whole host or a myriad of other different projects or operational imperatives, either driven by ourselves or by the clients. Very rarely did we ever really consider the waste in a constant basis. These imperatives have and did have real consequences. And with time, I suppose I can only really call it, we had a bit of an awakening across the business and really wanted to have a business that really did less harm. I know, unfortunately, that term "do less harm" is really not sufficient given the scale of the challenges that we face. But it really was a turning point for the business. When some of the questions we started to ask really were centered around waste. What was it? Were we willfully ignoring it? Who owns it? And ultimately, what can we do to reduce it? Unfortunately, for many of these answers, we had surprisingly few answers. Well, this talk is not per se focused around circular design process of reuse, recycling, remanufacture, really ultimately getting or moving away from the take, make and waste kind of process to one which is more circular. This is really taking a slightly unusual look really at language, mindset and the behaviours of waste and our relationship to it in our business, and really challenging some ideas of what's become normalised and standardised within our whole mode of operating as a business. So I'll jump in and start the presentation. I've called this wasteful thinking. Really all I'm suggesting by this is that we take a wider view of what waste is in our business. Waste is obviously a very human creation. It's something that we willfully ignore and push to the side because it's a difficult thing to challenge and it's a difficult thing to solve. But I'll take this approach by really looking at this 6-petal kind of idea where we have an operational model, an organisational model, an ownership model, the 3 sort of primary pillars, if you will, that form the nature of a business, and ultimately wrapped around that, the culture and the behaviours, the language and the mindset, and how these all lead to our unfortunately wasteful business practices. But if we filter these through, ultimately a reimagined purpose, where with waste at the heart, or waste thinking at the heart of it, we can ultimately design a better business for the future. So first, I'll look at language. Well, when I started, I thought, well, the word waste, what does it mean? Is it a valuable word or is it a valueless word? When actually you start to look into the thesaurus of the word waste, these are some of the words that pop up: rubbish, scrap, trash, debris, rubble, destroy, dwindle. These are all words that ultimately have put no intrinsic value on what is left behind in our business processes or our manufacturing process. This ultimately just shows the power of language for us to really diminish the value of what ultimately is a natural resource that we're using for the purposes of our businesses. Taking another look, these are normalized words. We're taking a resource and it's a natural capital that is really leading to economic success or potential economic success of our businesses, where ultimately we're using commodities. These, I would hazard a guess, that we don't really kind of challenge or question too much. They are just so normalized in our economic and lexicon of business. But what if we look at them in a slightly different way? Source, nature-based, regenerate. These are all words which are starting to be used within our businesses, some by more than by others. But source versus resource. Source is a finite. Resource really is a human-centered creation, which ultimately seems to put humanity at the center of nature, whereas source is, and maybe resource is, infinite, nature-based. Everything we use comes from nature. We live on a finite planet. Regenerate over commodity. Commodity is something that you buy in bulk, you sell in bulk, and probably don't consider the impacts of the nature of what that commodity is and where it comes from. But if we can start to think about ultimately everything we take comes from nature, ultimately we need to regenerate what we take. Expanding this idea slightly further, I had a conversation with a contact a few weeks ago, and we were discussing the idea of landfill, and it made me think, well, what is that word, landfill? Landfill is a soft word. Yes, we all know that it ultimately means putting rubbish in a hole in the ground, but actually, if you take the idea of that this is a garbage dump, then actually it changes our perspective. So actually softening the impact through our language of ultimately of what we're doing and the impacts we're having through our consumption and use of materials in our business can have a dramatic effect. Ultimately, this is what we're producing. So what I'm suggesting, business language drives collective behaviour. Change your language and ultimately we can change the behaviour in our business. And language does matter, and the words we choose do matter, and they do change the way that we act, either individually or collectively as a group. Next, I'll move on to mindset. We all hold mental models of the world. We all have biases. We all have leanings, which we're either mindful of or we're not mindful of. But these do have an impact on our relationship to waste within our business. Take a look at this animation and see what you think. Well, I showed sort of 4 images, or sketched out 4 images there. We have, let's say, nature as an absorber of pollution or CO2. We have nature as a thriving living entity which supports all sorts of habitats and life. We have nature as extraction or commodity, where actually we really only see it as having some intrinsic value or monetary value for our businesses. Or perhaps we see it as a universal nurturer for us and humanity. I'd hazard a guess that actually not one of these is the only mindset that we hold. But I think the important point here is the mental models we hold of our relationship to nature has an impact on how we act within our businesses. So expanding on this idea, I've been thinking about how do we purchase within our business? Are we a buyer or are we a supplier? Buyers and suppliers, all those mindsets really tend to focus everything and all our actions in and around a monetary value, which doesn't really imbue natural sources and materials with any intrinsic natural value. So how can we change that buyer and supplier mindset? where we may really only be looking at the bottom line and the money saving aspects of this transaction that we have between buying and supplying. Can we wrap around the regenerator mindset into this thinking? Ultimately questioning our mental model, moving from a wasteful mindset to a regenerative mindset. Again, this is a what if question. Can we do this? How can we do it? And what ultimately positive impact would that have on our relationship to waste? Now moving on to operational model. This really is the systems and processes that we operate within our business, the accounting, the project management, the sales, the marketing, all of these things that we build as standard models within our business. Do these create issues, or are these creating impacts and increasing our generation of waste within our businesses? Well, I read a book recently, Green Swans by John Elkington. In his words, the coming boom of regenerative capitalism. There's a lot of good in the book, and one of the things it proposes, and I would support, is changing the way that we look at our organisation, centering our organisation within a system value process, one ultimately where everything is independent on each other. So our organisation lives within a society, and society lives within the planet, and ultimately the planet is the planet, and ultimately is the one that ultimately supports us. Really is the changes our nature and our way that we view our organisation, rather than our organisation finishing at the boundaries of our organisation. Ultimately our impacts, so they're all interrelated and interdependent. This can have a huge impact on our understanding of what we consume and ultimately what we waste. Another way to look at the business, this is something that became increasingly evident within the work that we were doing with in my previous business with our clients. The way we create our balance sheets, our profit and loss, our budgeting, when we break it down, ultimately these are all monetary values. The accounting system is finite and limited. Even what we put forward to in our corporate tax returns at the end of the year really only focuses around money. It is changing. This is expanding, particularly for large PLCs. There is going to be some accountability for human impact and for natural impact. But how can we really move to a full cost accounting situation where we start to look at really the true cost of everything we spend within our business? What are we trying to paper over the cracks with by either not accounting for it or not listing it, or ultimately, what are we spending our money on? I'll give an example. We had one conversation a few years ago with a client that was spending millions on marketing. This was physical marketing, and no one was asking the question either was it well spent, but ultimately what impact did those millions have? Again, I would hazard a guess that 95% of those millions would ultimately end up a hole in the ground. We need to question what these budget lines are and what impact they're having in the production of waste in our businesses. And finally, within this section of thought, depreciation and write-off. This is a hugely impactful area, one where when we buy assets and stick them on an asset register, through our accounting processes, we write them off over 2 or 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, but ultimately we're driving them down to what would be considered in language as worthless. Are they really worthless? Again, we need to change this accounting and this economic paradigm and start to really consider the materials that we use have intrinsic long-term value. So change your operating models to give materials and sources an intrinsic natural value, as I was just saying. Can we get to a mindset where we can be infinitely regenerative in what we do? A challenge for sure, but definitely something that we should strive towards. Now looking at the organisational model of our businesses, so the way that we work together, so the ways that we come together and collaborate to really have an impact to drive our reduction in waste. As I said previously, experiencing waste through a shared system of the way that we see ourselves individually and as an organisation within planet and society will definitely change our relationship to waste. So seeing it, feeling it, smelling it, talking about it, experiencing it, thinking about it, hearing it even, from personal experience, when we start to do this, this can have a huge impact on our ability to reduce our waste and our consumption. In my previous business, everybody that came through the business went to factories, saw the waste, saw the processes, understood the full manufacturing process of what it was that we were ultimately doing as a business, regardless of their position and their role. And this ultimately did change the way that we work together and the way that we experience waste together. And waste became a normal topic of conversation, and particularly even closing down the end of a project, talking about waste and its impacts and other kind of negative impacts of the process of our business was hugely important. Finishing this section, I think really when we see something, we can change something. There's a story in a book I read recently by Donella Meadows about thinking in systems or system thinking. It was about a story in Amsterdam where identical houses were built, and some houses had the electric meter in the basement and some had them in the hallway. Obviously, naturally, the ones that had them in the hallway, the electric consumption was 30% less. We all now have smart meters. Ultimately, this is behavioural change stuff where when we see what we use and see ultimately the impacts of what we're using, I know obviously this one's in monetary value, it changes our behaviour. Well, the same is about seeing physical waste in and around the processes of how we operate within our businesses and how we experience that waste as a team or across a business is hugely important. So see it, feel it, talk about it, experience it, and ultimately collaborate to reduce it. Ownership model in this context, I'm not really ultimately talking about who owns the business, but clearly that does have an impact. If we're misaligned in terms of the internal or founder ownership or investments or investors, if there's a misalignment of purpose in our understanding what our relationship to waste is, of course that can have an impact. But what I'm talking about, are we looking at things the wrong way? Are they so far away from us that we don't see them, or they lose impact to us individually within our roles and within our jobs within our business? When we assign the role of sustainability manager or within a business, are we absolving our responsibility as individuals to our impacts and our relationship to waste? Ultimately, we're all responsible. We all have a duty of care to own waste within our business. Even if it's just the paper on our desks or our consumption within our offices on a day-to-day. So it's really turning that telescope around and bringing everything up close and living and experiencing it together collectively as a team and as individually, and seeing it and feeling it. So obviously seeking alignment principles on waste is hugely important with the owners, the employees and all the stakeholders in our business. And finally, cultures and behaviours. Ultimately, this is the wrapper that goes around everything we do as a business. So we create all the policies and principles and of our organisations, but ultimately it's the culture and behaviour that drives the change. So what do we ultimately need to do? We need to find purposeful waste reduction, or put in another way, put purpose, or put waste at the centre of our purpose within our businesses. Not as something which is a bad thing, but which is a good thing, because ultimately how can we turn the idea and not hide the idea of waste, but actually write in principles and values and the behaviours that we take to the waste that we ultimately generate within our business. You know, our mindsets matter, our language matters, our behaviours matter. Ultimately, all of this, along with better design processes, more circularity, more orientation, more understanding that we are from nature and of nature, will lead us to a better outcome in our pursuit of reducing waste, and ultimately put us in a better position to create a better relationship to waste. So create shared values with our relationship to the natural world and its life-giving sources. That's ultimately what we're trying to do here. So thank you very much, and if you have any feedback, please let me know.